Welcome back to Rethinking Politics, episode 97. This week, as the world continues to focus on inflation and the cost of everything going up and the value of money decreasing, and how many ways can I say this same idea off the top of my head? It's like when we were looking at the things people are interested in politics, the like biggest issues facing them, and they were like number 1, inflation, number 2, the economy, number 3, cost of goods. I'm basically those people. We wanted to talk about a related issue, and the related issue is the budget. Now, this could be talked about really at any time, but I saw that Rand Paul pulled out a budget called the 6-penny plan, is what it's been nicknamed.
Oh, because you think that's all the money the federal government deserves is 6 pennies. I get it. It's good. It's good. I like it.
6 pennies. If we reduce their budget to 6 cents,
we should be able to solve a number of problems.
You certainly would limit the problems government was causing would be significantly limited. Whatever else was happening, we'll set aside. We'll just look at the positive.
Yeah, exactly. Think positive, Dan. That's what I've been doing ever since COVID.
So, ever since COVID, good. I hear it's good for your health. It can't be worse than some of the other recommendations. So as far as the budget goes, there's lots of, obviously when we're talking the budget of the federal government, we could be talking about anything, which makes it really convenient in a lot of ways. I'm looking at Brad's face and he's just over there trying not to make eye contact through the computer.
It's pretty
Which
easy,
is pretty easy because generally you actually can't make eye contact through the computer unless you put the camera on your eyes or something. Anyway, it used to be that there would be a budget written by Congress where they would say, we expect to bring in X amount of money through taxes. Here's how that money's going to be spent. Now that's too old-fashioned for these days. These days, we go, how much do we have to give them to keep everything running? In a panicked moment, a week before everything shuts down.
To be fair, Dan.
And people throw numbers up there.
The normal process proceeds and doesn't work and inevitably results in that chaotic moment at the end. You know, on paper, theoretically, everything could go according to plan. And the plan is wild. It's a lengthy process. The president will actually submit his budget in February, and the fiscal year doesn't start until October. So it's half the year that this process is going on, and they still can't get it figured out in that time. You know, it's not like they only had 2 weeks and they couldn't figure it out. No, they had a long time and still couldn't figure it out. But let's talk some details before we get into this, because why are we talking about this? There's a number of reasons. The number one reason is there are a few pressing problems that are going to become an issue. You know, people always talk about fiscal responsibility and blah, blah, blah. Governments, by definition, are not responsible, nor are they anything like responsible. So that shouldn't even be a goal, right? No, let's talk about what's actually going to happen, because the federal government has been fiscally irresponsible for decades and nothing bad's happened yet, right? So here's the things that are on the table for the federal government. The two biggest things is the ballooning national debt is eventually going to become a problem, because the thing is that right now our federal debt is somewhere around $30 trillion, which is significantly more than the gross domestic product of the United States. In other words, all that's being produced in the United States, all the money that the United States is making, not as a government, but as a country, isn't even enough to pay the national debt down, which is wild. And on top of that, you've got a few growing problems with that. Number one, the interest payments. The interest payments right now are somewhere around $300 billion a year. So every year when we make this budget, Dan, a growing chunk of that budget is just the interest payments on that debt. And those interest payments are ballooning. And so they're going to continue growing, and which of course leads to the big problem with this debt, is that even if our debtors are benevolent, which is the argument that's always made is, hey, we don't have to pay these off right now. It's not a big deal. The fact of the matter is if the interest keeps growing and the debt keeps growing, there's no way for us to ever pay it back at all. And not just pay it back, but stop that interest from ballooning. And pretty soon we won't be able to have a federal government budget at all because the interest payments will be larger than the federal budget. You know, that's just one example of the kind of problem you can have with this national debt. The other...
Yes, I don't know how it's calculated, but the Department of Labor gives the number 440 billion for the interest on debt currently. And it is the fourth largest item on the budget after Medicaid and Medicare together are number one, Social Security number two, defense number three, number four is the interest
and
on the
how
debt.
you calculate that interest will give you different numbers. And that's one of the great things about these federal budget numbers is when you're talking in the trillions of dollars, it's nuts. You know what I mean? When we talk about the ultra rich where we're like, what would we even do with that much money? We're talking hundreds of billions. You know what I mean? This is a kind of thing where Elon Musk could liquidate all of his assets and he could put a dent on 1 year's interest payments on the debt. You know what I mean? That's the kind of money we're talking about.
Right.
And then the other problem we have is Social Security. Social Security is slowly going down the drain and is no longer paying for itself and is going to get considerably worse over the next few years. And since Social Security is such a large part of the budget, that could cause some serious ripple effects. So those are kind of the two big reasons people focus on the federal budget and why it matters, is that the federal government needs to be able to pay its bills, and the federal government needs to be able to pay for Social Security, because those are two things we rely on. I mean, we joke about having the federal government collapse tomorrow by only paying it 6 cents. But the reality is whether or not you like the federal government is here. The federal government makes up a surprising percentage of the U.S. gross domestic output. You know what I mean? A huge proportion of the resources we produce as a country go into the federal government and then back out to the people. And so if you cut off that tap overnight, there's going to be serious problems. You know what I mean? Medicare and Medicaid are a huge proportion of the money that supports, you know, hospitals and so many other industries that we rely on. Social Security is the de facto retirement plan of a huge number of current retirees and soon to be retirees. You know, you pull these rugs out from underneath people and we're talking, you know, potentially economic collapse widespread.
Right. Joking aside, you're absolutely right that these things are very serious. In order to put the numbers into terms that people can appreciate a little more, the U.S. Department of Labor has numbers like the debt per citizen. That basically, if you were to take the debt and you were to split it up among every person in the United States, some 300 million
every
people,
man, woman, and child, not just every work.
Every single person, it would be $91,795 per person. If you were to do it by taxpayers, who are ultimately the only people actually contributing to doing anything with the debt, it's $242,986. It's a lot of money. And the idea is that we're all in some ways in debt through this process. And when you think about it that way, I think it hits people a little bit harder. Like, how would you feel if you knew you also owed another $250,000 almost? You know, it puts things into perspective a little bit. So one of the interesting things about this, so you mentioned it, the total number is about 30 trillion. I almost say billion. I'm looking at the numbers updated live at the usdebtclock.org. It's a fun little site if you haven't been there. It gives you a variety of numbers and they're updated. When I say updated live, I think what they're doing is they're acting on updates, but they're spreading them across time. I don't think we actually can collect all this data live.
Well, and usually it's done in chunks. You know, they'll approve an extra billion in debt or 500 million or whatever.
And then that'll play out on the clock. So the clock is constantly running like a clock, right? The numbers are constantly ticking up. And they're not like jumping exponentially usually. So I'm not sure, the way they've decided to update it and those kind of things, but but the numbers are from the US government itself. So it's as accurate as you're going to get, probably, depending on how you want to calculate the numbers. As Brad indicated, some of these, depending on how you calculate them, are going to be a little odd. Can give you radically different numbers depending on what's included, especially when you're talking about massive amounts of money and what's categorized with what. So this number, in terms of should we freak out, is the first question, right? If we're in debt a massive amount, and if you were to apply it to every citizen, every taxpayer, it'd be over $200,000 per taxpayer. That seems really bad. If we're making interest payments on this on a regular basis, that seems bad. Right? There's some basic math here we could do. We could say if I'm going to buy something and I can buy part 1 this month and part 2 next month, or I could buy part 1 and 2 this month, but I have to pay 10% interest, we can see that in 2 months, I'm going to have lost 10%. Right? I'm paying interest of 10%. That's money that's not getting me any more stuff.
Yeah, and it's not always necessarily a bad thing. If you're running a business and you're part 1 and part 2 of the machine to produce your good, if you can produce it during those 2 months rather than producing nothing, it might be worth that 10%. But that 10% is a very real cost that you're paying to have it now versus having later.
Yes, and that's exactly, really glad you pointed that out, because that's exactly the basic calculus of a business, right? Everything involved costs money, generally speaking, and especially for some kind of manufacturing. All of the tools, all of the equipment, all of the initial investment costs money. And the only reason you would do that is if in the long run you expect this to pay you more than you're going to pay for the goods and the interest, which you're factoring in. The U.S. government does not turn an interest in terms of the positive things.
You mean? It doesn't turn that interest into a profit.
I apologize. Yes. It's not making money on the investment of its spending. Now you could get into the weeds of each particular issue and say, by spending money on dealing with education now, right, we're investing in the future and infrastructure and so on. But in terms of the investment per dollar, I mean, there's a variety of economists will go through and they'll try and calculate the effect that money had inserting it into the economy at point A, and years later they're trying to estimate how much of a return they got on that. And just kind of glancing over what's the word I'm looking for? Skimming over the economics of this. And maybe that would be something to be interesting to set aside for another time, especially next time there's a big project that they're selling people as, we're going to spend $1 trillion now and it's going to have a multiplying effect, is the term they use. And it will be as good as spending $4 trillion later. Mm-hmm. They use these terms to create this sense of it's an investment that actually is going to return some kind of profit. And then they have various economic testing that they do to try and verify this. Let me just say in short that you cannot verify that. You can't. A business has profit margins. It has things that it's tracking. You can track the expenses. You can track your profits. You can see how much comes in, and you can balance your books, right? The federal government throwing money out into the nether and then trying to figure out what kind of multiplier it has is smoke and mirrors.
Well, let me put it this way, Dan. If they've been throwing these multipliers out for decades, why isn't the GDP so much larger than the national debt currently? You know what I mean? If the things they were doing were growing the economy in exponential ways that took time to manifest, then shouldn't we be seeing those benefits and making it so that we were able to have a balanced budget now? You know what I mean? Because we're not seeing that. We're seeing that every year for since 1974, every year since 1974, the federal debt to GDP ratio has gotten worse. So we've been growing the debt faster than the U.S. economy has been growing. In other words, our ability to pay off the debt has just been getting worse. There might be 1 or 2 years where it pauses, but generally, for the past 50 years, our ability to pay off the debt has just gotten worse and worse and worse as we've gotten more and more in debt. Not just numerically, but relative to what we're actually producing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Let's put a pin on this idea because I think this could be a really interesting one to bring up again and look at a little closer. This idea of the multiplier effect through government spending, because I think that is a key argument that is made in defense of this kind of spending. For now, we're going to set that aside. We're going to focus on this deficit topic we've picked up. So there's a couple lines of thought regarding whether or not debt is good and when is it good with regards to the federal government. With business, it's really clear. The debt is justified when you can use it to make more money, when it can be profitable, essentially. But with regards to the federal government, when spending is justified and when it isn't is a little bit hazy, and it depends on some theories of economics. Now, there's one group, and this is a relatively small group, thankfully, that says there is actually zero problem with having a growing and ballooning deficit because the federal government can always pay its bills because it owns the printer. Now, this group is so far removed from economic realities. Hopefully they're getting a bit of a wake-up call right now with the inflation and things. There's a reason you don't want to just print everything all the time. There's a reason when you owe money, you don't just pay it with printed money. Now we do to some degree, but that's besides the point. You could make inflation much, much worse. You could have all of the problems of inflation multiplied by just being like, you know what? We owe 30 trillion. Boom. Done. And that would be a massive wealth destruction in the US. And obviously right now would be the worst possible time to contemplate it. But the more modern and mainstream thinkers will argue that yes, debt is a problem, and we're not thrilled about the interest rate we have to pay. But there's a time and a place to focus on paying the debt, and there's a time to spend. When there's an economic crisis, you need to spend in order to get people out of the economic crisis. And as such, if you focus on balancing the budget or you focus on trying to cut back during times of economic crisis, you're actually being counterproductive. Part of the reasoning here is, again, pointing back to the multiplier effect, that during this time, spending needs to happen, and the people aren't going to spend, so you need to spend. And thus, if you're increasing the debt, that's okay. It gets everything going.
And Dan, this middle group is really born of war historically. In the past, it hasn't been so much times of economic crisis as times when the country has gone to war. I mean, you can go back and look at the U.S. Federal debt by year, and you'll notice that the worst the federal deficit ever got in terms of federal budget. No, sorry. Words. Federal debt. The worst the federal debt ever got relative to GDP was at the very end of World War II. World War II, the federal debt ballooned like crazy to pay for the war. And that's right along with that argument where during these times of necessity, during these times where we need to take care of this right now, we need to go into debt. Almost like a crisis in a business or a crisis in someone's life. We need to go into debt right now to take care of this crisis. And then as soon as World War II is over, you can watch as year over year over year, that debt to GDP ratio got better and better and better for several decades afterwards. So it wasn't like they used that excuse and then continued to balloon the debt. No, they actually did work on it after that.
Right. The idea of the multiplier effect that we mentioned is something of a post hoc explanation afterward. They're like, not only is it necessary, it's good. Not only is it something you have to do in some cases when you must, but it's something that is actually beneficial, and we need to do more of it. The war isn't enough to get spending. We need to spend more things. You're absolutely right to point back to war. So many of the things that have been convenient for political powers in the past eventually become defended economic theories, and not just necessary evils, but positive goods. The final group is the group that says government debt is not acceptable. Under any circumstances, you could probably make exceptions for things like war, if it's a war of, for survival and things like that. That the federal government should be essentially balancing the budget, and we should be minimizing debt at all times. The difference here is often a fundamental one of economic theory. This group is often much more, what's the word? Less government involvement. This is often partisan lines. Yeah, I'm looking for a good term. I don't want to give them too much credit, because often this is a group that we're critiquing as well as agreeing with partially. And
yes, the conservatives have a tendency to tout balancing the budget and fiscal responsibility. That doesn't mean they do it, but that does tend to be a party line policy position.
Yeah, it's an important part of the party platform. It's an important part of why they're elected and why people vote for them. It's not something that they have enough interest in doing that they do it. It's never all that important when they're in office and they have the branches necessary to make it happen.
Dan, that brings me to my biggest thing about the budget, is that the fundamental problem here is how the government is set up. When you do your own personal finances and you take on debt in times of crisis or in times of difficulty or whatever is going on, you make calculations about the future and about your ability to pay it off and what your options are, and all of those things come into play. Even as something as simple as purchasing a car, which usually involves going into debt, especially if it's a new car. Most people don't have 30 grand just lying around. And so you make calculations about what you're able to pay off, because you're going to have to live with the consequences of that. And that if you file for bankruptcy because you can't pay it off and you have too much debt, that's going to significantly impact your life. It'll crush your credit score. It'll affect your ability to purchase a home. It'll affect your ability to purchase a car. It'll increase your interest rates. All of these things are negative consequences to poor decisions, which encourages you as an individual to make good decisions, because you have to live with the consequences. The federal government is a little bit different, because while the country has to live with the consequences, in terms of the people who are actually making the decisions, the politicians, they aren't going to be running the country forever, especially because the people who get to the most powerful positions tend to be at the end of their career. You know what I mean? You look at, the Speaker of the House, you look at the President of the United States. These are not 40-somethings who have just started their political career. These are people who are, 10 to 15 years past the age when they should have retired, and they're on their last legs. It's not that they won't be running the country in 10 years. It's that they won't be alive in 10 years.
But if they are, they're going to be running the country still at this rate. Let's just be clear here. None of these people seem like they're retiring.
And so what's going to happen 30 or 40 years doesn't affect them as much. And that's the other thing about government on this scale, is that the consequences can be pushed off much farther than they can for a personal individual. When I purchase a car and I set up a car loan, I'm not setting up a 120-year loan. You know what I mean? I'm setting up a 5-year loan, a 7-year loan, a 6-year loan. It's a much shorter time frame. With these government loans, it's not. You know what I mean? We're able to keep ballooning our debt in a way a normal individual couldn't, and keep passing the buck over and over and over again. And it makes sense when you think about these politicians and their incentives. I mean, it's the same reason conservative politicians, when they get in power, don't balance the budget. It's the reason Donald Trump didn't balance the budget when he was president of the United States, because he ran on a policy of cutting taxes and cutting spending, but he could only cut taxes so much, and the more he cut taxes, the smaller the budget was, which made it harder to balance. And then he could cut spending, but most of the spending the federal government makes is actually not up for being cut. You know, when they talk about making that budget every year, Dan, I don't know if you know this, but they actually don't decide on huge chunks of it. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they can't touch it. They can't touch whether or not they pay, interest payments on those loans. So all they get to decide is this smaller portion of the budget. You know, when we're looking at a $6 trillion budget, about $4 trillion of that is mandatory. So only 1/3 of that budget is actually being decided by Congress. So when we're talking about balancing the budget, and the part of the budget that we have discretion over is actually smaller than the deficit, in other words, it's literally impossible to balance the budget the way it's set up right now. It doesn't make sense. How can you balance a budget when your revenue is about the same size as your mandatory spending? In other words, if you cut all of the discretionary spending, so if you cut the military budget to zero, so you ended the United States military, not cut out some of the unnecessary bases, just ended it, sent everyone home, said goodbye. Sell the helicopters, we're done. And then got rid of every other discretionary spending, whether that's any of the things the federal government's wasting their time on every year. You cut all of that, except for the mandatory things, and you would come close to balancing the budget and wouldn't even start taking on the national debt. That would just be not growing the national debt. That's how messed up the federal budget is right now. So as a conservative politician, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to go out there and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to cut our discretionary budget in half. So we're going to cut the military down to bare bones. We're going to cut these programs all down to bare bones. And on top of that, I'm going to double taxes. Why? Because we need to have a balanced budget, and this is the only way to do it. Who's going to vote that guy in? Says, I'm going to give you less of what you want, and I'm going to tax you twice as much for it. Who's going to vote for that guy? No one on either party.
It seems wildly unpopular. The good news is it'll be our children and grandchildren who suffer most of the consequences, or so the story goes. And that's unfortunately, there's a lot to that. It's a debt that doesn't apply to anyone in particular. No one really suffers the direct consequences, or at least not alone. There are certainly hidden consequences like the interest on the debt that we pay all the time that you mentioned. It's amazing. So Rand Paul's budget, and let me begin by saying, there's no reason to hope that this ever passes. Because in the current political climate, there's not a chance. Because he actually wants to balance the budget, which means he's not only cutting massive discretionary spending.
It's the only way to balance the budget is you have to go after Medicare and Social Security, which is political suicide.
Yes. So he doesn't, in this particular proposal, he's not going to touch Social Security. He is going after Medicaid and Medicare. I don't know the details of what exactly he was intending to do with that. I know he's floated things like, health insurance saving accounts in the past and things like that. Private, what's the term for it?
HSAs?
Private savings accounts.
Health savings
Private
accounts?
Health savings.
Yeah.
Health savings accounts. Yeah, all these terms here. Health, private, savings. Some of they fit in some order there to describe.
If we combine these words correctly, we'll have hit upon something amazing.
We'll hit upon the standard terminology for this thing. And as you were saying, you have to do that. Right now, the projected tax revenue, I'm really intrigued to see if we get anywhere close to it. But again, inflation has an impact on all of this stuff as well in terms of the federal government. It's actually good for debt in some ways. Generally, people look at inflation as beneficial for debt. And that is true. You can increase the number of dollars out there and decrease their individual value, you can accumulate more of them, and the debt can't factor that in. The number is to some degree frozen in the currency levels that it was acquired in. And so
and we've talked about that before, about how inflation actually changes your time preference and makes you more likely to go into debt because you'd rather buy something today and pay with tomorrow's money, because tomorrow's money is going to be worth less than today's money. And so in many ways you can actually be better off, which is weird. It's very counterintuitive.
It's counterintuitive, but there's something fundamentally, it certainly makes investing more tempting, which is the point.
Tempting?
Or at least the perceived point. It makes, as you were saying, spending in the short run more tempting, whether that be in...
Yeah. Makes borrowing more tempting.
Yes. Thank you. Which is generally, I'm relating it to businesses, but investing is not the right term. Anyway, so all of this, I just look at this debt clock, which is having the exact effect it was designed to have as I'm staring at it. Right? The reason you would format it like this is to frighten people. It's to create a response.
Sense of urgency.
A sense of urgency, yes, that this is something like a bomb. And at the very least, you can imagine what we could do with an extra $500,000 a year, $440,000 as it's measured here, 300 in the numbers you were looking at, Brad. And if we didn't have to pay that, what that would look like.
You said $400,000 a year. I think you meant a different number.
I did. Like any other normal human being, I'm not used to seeing numbers with this many zeros.
When we're talking big numbers, we're talking thousands, you know?
My mind keeps auto-correcting the last digits into decimals, right? The last three at least have to be decimals, right? But maybe even... That's right. That's right. Fractions here. At some point it switches to fractions, right? Right?
But yes, the extra $400 billion a year that we're just spending on interest.
Yes. That even if you just took that and you invested in something, you could do a crazy amount of things. People were talking about Elon Musk being able to feed solve starvation with, what was the number? I think it was either
I thought it was like
4
$6
billion
or something. Billion. It was small.
It was ridiculously low. For a fraction of the money we're spending on this, apparently we could solve world hunger. That's absolutely not true, but that was the story. If it were that simple, it would have been done. If it were that simple, we'd print that money out today and it would happen. If it were that easy, why wouldn't a politician run on that if they could get away with that? Like, yeah, I'm gonna cut one military base that you didn't know existed
and solve world hunger.
I'm going to use that money to solve world hunger, right?
Mm-hmm.
So jumping back to the one thing he didn't touch in this particular iteration of his budget plan. This is at least the second. The other one I think was
going to be 6, since it's 6 pennies,
penny
right?
plan. Maybe it was
1 penny
maybe
per
the first
plan.
one was the 1 penny plan. I know the last one was the 5 penny plan. I stumbled on it as I was looking. I was like, wait a second, this has happened before.
See, even Rand Paul can't be fiscally responsible with his naming of his plans. You know, they keep growing in size.
Even his budget names are ballooning.
Exactly. Uncontrollable.
Social Security. There's a reason he didn't touch Social Security, and there's a reason that it's universally thought of as insolvent.
Because he doesn't want to get mugged again?
It's probably one of several reasons. Hopefully not the most pertinent reason. Hopefully he's not that frightened of getting mugged, but it's not such a risk that it's number one on the list. Social Security in particular has massive problems. Brad, you summed it up really well the other day, but let me just say the original reasoning and then you carry us through, because it was cracking me up and it was brutal and accurate, unfortunately. Social Security began as like, hey, let's help people save some money for retirement. What we're going to do is we're going to make it mandatory that you set aside a certain amount. And it goes into this pool that you can draw from later in life. That's not going to be based specifically on what you pay into it, because some people will pay a lot more. You know, we'll take a little extra from the wealthy, and
it's going to be subsidized around a little bit.
Yes, we're gonna do a little redistributing here, but in general, the basic idea is that you're going to save money, and it's going to be paid back to you. For the lower and middle classes, that's effectively what it amounted to. So, let's do that. It's simple enough. And then a number of things happened. The first of which is, who trusted these people to save money? Why did we give the money to the one group that we can be certain is incapable of saving money?
Yes, because that's the inherent problem is what self-respecting politician is going to collect money today and not spend it for 40 years, long after they're out of office. You know what I mean? Who's going to propose something that's going to cost people right now, but is not going to benefit anyone until long after every single congressman is out of office? Who's going to vote for that? No one. So the obvious solution is, okay, well, let's start paying people on day one, because we're drawing in money on day one. We're getting all these people paying into Social Security. Then we take that money and we pay for all the people who are retiring right now and who have already retired. And then we continue to do that year after year, and it's no problem. And the great thing is, we have a very small retired population. People retire fairly late. They don't live a super long time. And we have a growing population, so there are many more working people than there are retired people. You got all these young people and not that many old people. So it'll be no problem for us to take care of a pressing problem right now, because this is Great Depression, FDR. Let's take care of this pressing problem of these retirees who can't afford to eat. We're going to take care of them. Everyone's going to love it. Everyone's going to be putting money in and thinking that they're putting in money for their own retirement, while at the same time helping out these elderly people. It's, the ultimate win-win-win.
Somehow your money is paying for these people to retire and you retire.
And for those of you who are from Utah or have ever been exposed to what we like to call a pyramid scheme, you might be familiar with this kind of speaking where it's like, wait, how many wins was that? How is it possible that this costs nothing and everyone benefits? Could you explain that to me again? It's like, okay, well, it's very simple. You have a small number of people who are benefiting, and you get a larger pool underneath them, and they give their money up, and you get an even larger pool beneath them, and they bring their money up, and it continues forever and ever, and everyone wins. Well, what inevitably happens with a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme is you run out of people. You run out of people, and then the whole system falls apart, and they leave and they go start another one. Great thing about government pyramid schemes is it take a long time. So by the time this scheme falls apart, not only will you be dead, but your political, descendants will be dead, and they'll be dead, and they'll be dead. I mean, FDR has been dead for how long now? A long, long time. That people have been able to enjoy this pyramid scheme, and now, the buck stops. We don't have that growing population anymore like we used to have that made this work. Where as long as that younger population kept growing and growing and growing, it helps support that elderly population. But now we don't have a growing population, and we have a population that was large from the past when it was growing. Those growing populations have now grown up and are now collecting benefits, and who's going to pay for them? And that's why the calculations, which could be way off, it could be way worse than this, are predicting that Social Security is going to continue to teeter, and unless it gets new external money, is going to fall apart. In other words, you can't cut from Social Security. You actually have to put more money into Social Security, either through increasing taxes or taking from somewhere else in order to keep Social Security working. So rather than that mandatory spending staying the same, it actually needs to grow, at least in terms of Social Security, in order for Social Security to continue to work.
This is part of what will be a growing series of problems. Here it's most clear because, like you said, it's essentially a pyramid scheme. So here it's going to be obvious, but this is one of many problems that is going to be caused by the switch where we go from having where the ratio of the populations, what's the word I'm looking for? the ratio of the generations is going to be flopping. Where you used to have, each generation used to be bigger than the previous generation, and that's just not true anymore. This is going to go off like a bomb in our politics. It's going to go off like a nuclear bomb in Chinese politics. We mentioned it a little bit when we were talking about China and why China actually is not the future. And part of it is because their ratio of people who are old is going to be 6-1 compared to every other generation combined. It's going to be like, it's insane. It's insane. They're going to have no way to pay for even like the healthcare of that group, let alone, keep their economy moving forward. And as we hit those same kind of blocks, things like Medicaid and Medicare are going to become relatively more expensive and have relatively fewer people paying into the taxes, right? This is all of this is going to increase the cost of our most expensive pieces already. Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. And it's a good thing the debt isn't growing, or the fourth one, the interest rate, would also be a problem. Oh, wait. That's also growing. Oh, wait. We're not even close to balancing the budget, right? There's, to some degree, I'm not comforted by the thought that all this is going to fall apart at some point, or that at least pieces here and there are going to start to crumble. But there is an economic reality undergirding all of these numbers. There's a world of stuff and people, and there's only so much stuff, and that stuff is valuable as people produce it, and as we have these investments in production process and all these things. And it's not, you can't merely, for so long, the government has, in a variety of these ways, tried to solve fundamental problems through simple redistribution without actually creating more stuff. And it won't last. It appears like it won't last. We could get maybe the technological breakthroughs will continue to allow us to do these things for a while. Maybe we'll get some, other things that will happen. But we may have to actually cut things back if we want to continue as a country, as opposed to have some kind of serious collapse.
And the thing is you're absolutely right. The only way to stop a brutal economic collapse, and as we've seen with COVID, those are very real and very possible, because COVID was, at least in the United States, a mild interruption of our normal lives. Most businesses didn't stop. Most major services kept running for the most part with minor interruptions. And yet,
ironically, it was like the elite classes generally that stopped, and they felt like everything had stopped them. And some of the entertainment.
Those of us in the blue collar world were like, no, nothing stopped. What are you talking about? You haven't been to work in 6 months. I never stopped going to work for a week,
Except when you were quarantined.
Yeah, well, I didn't get COVID till 2021, so all of 2020, it was just work like normal, except you couldn't do anything fun. But work was still there, don't you worry.
Yeah.
But anyways, where was I going?
You're talking about how it was a smaller scale economic
disruption, but it's still having crazy ramifications to this day. If you had the kind of thing where the U.S. government became insolvent, where it couldn't pay its debts anymore, and basically collapsed as a financial institution, not necessarily as a government, but as a financial institution, if the United States government collapsed, it would wreck the entire world's economy for who knows how long, because everything is tied in to the U.S. financial system. The dollar, the treasury, these bonds are what the whole system is built around. They are the bedrock, and they are a house of cards that is getting worse all the time. And if that collapses, it will make COVID look like a walk in the park.
It would be absolutely devastating. The basic exchanges going on, like imports and exports, would fall apart, and among other things. And we'd radically have shortages and we'd immediately have radical shortages of all kinds of things.
But the only way to stop that from happening is to make the kind of hard cuts that no one's going to be okay making until they've fully accepted that reality. Until you believe that collapse is possible, you'll never accept saying, hey, we're going to cut Social Security benefits in half, and we're going to cut Medicare benefits in half, and Medicaid benefits in half, and so many other benefits in half, while keeping all the taxes the same. You know what I mean? No one's going to support something extreme like that until they believe in that reality.
Yes, this happens to people all the time on a personal scale, right? Where they're spending much more than they're making. they get to a point where they have to be like, things start falling apart. Their car gets taken or they start getting evicted from their home or something. And then they have to make radical lifestyle changes. And for a while, they're just getting less out of life, right? They're just as they try and pay off their debts, as they try and become solvent.
Yeah, but they could have done that by themselves earlier and it wouldn't have been as bad. But it was bad enough that most people aren't willing to make that choice.
Yeah, not only would it not have been as bad, it's possible they would have had, in fact, it's not possible, it's likely they'd have had much more because they wouldn't have to be paying interest and have these debts and have the other fallout that comes from it. It's they've sacrificed the long term for the short term. But now try running on that as a politician. Try being the one who's like, all these programs that we talk about, all these things that we're like, oh, what would you like the government to do this time? Those have costs. And we're going to keep the costs and you're going to feel them. But all the benefits are going, some of the benefits are going to disappear. You're going to elect me and your life is going to get worse.
Yeah. In the short run, in order to stop it from getting much worse in the medium run.
Yes. And maybe that much worse wouldn't hit until after you're dead anyway. And maybe we're stopping a disaster that's going to come after you're gone.
Which is possible, but for everyone under 40, it's a lot less possible. I mean,
yes.
At a certain point, these things are going to catch up. I mean, Social Security, the numbers we're talking about, if you're under 40, by the time you retire, Social Security is going to be struggling. I mean, those numbers are published. I mean, federal government, those are official numbers have been published talking about how I think it's 10, 15 years from now where Social Security will only be able to pay 75% of the expected benefits. Like they will only have 75% of the money they need.
Yes. Yeah. In any congressman in the Senate or House will know that at this point. We'll be aware of that. And we'll have, as a body, done nothing so far. But once that one hits, for example, I imagine what they're going to do is they're just going to start paying for it in the short run. They'll just be like, okay, we'll just add that to the budget.
Yeah. Increase the deficit to take care of it. It's like, okay, well, we solved one problem by making the other problem worse.
Yes, we've got these leaky holes. We're going to we're going to take the plug out of this one to put it in that one.
I think it's more of we're bailing out the ship, but instead of bailing the water out of the ship, we're moving it from one compartment to the other compartment. This compartment's much larger, so it can handle it.
Yes.
But the water's not leaving the ship.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to stop it, especially when the consequences seem so far away and may not occur on your watch. Especially, it's hard enough for the ordinary person when it's confronting them to change their lifestyle and deal with the debt. When they can, often there's some scenarios where life is such you can't deal with it at all. But on a scale of politics, where the politicians have to sell the idea to the people. I've listened to people like, we often mention Breaking Points on this show because they're a new independent news group who I think do excellent work. They're also openly kind of Bernie Sanders socialist. Mm-hmm. And they talk about how, right now, one of the most popular, there are a variety of programs that are extremely popular if you poll people. Things like free daycare. Mm-hmm. In fact, you could insert the word free before almost any program.
Anything, it'll get popular.
And ask people, do you want this? And the answer is yes. Of course they do.
Free hot dogs. Why not?
Yeah. What's the worst? It could hurt me if it's free. And it's not just, I'm not just suggesting that the people are ignorant. We talked a little bit about our choice theory, where you have to make choices and you're making choices at the margin. And at the margin, you're looking at the costs and benefits and things and you're calculating this. That the margin of a personal choice in the face of debt and the consequences that you're about to suffer are radically different than what a politician is looking at and what the voter is looking at.
Yes, because if you're sitting there and you're getting offered a free hot dog by the federal government. You're making a personal judgment about what's best for your life. And you're like, is it better for the federal deficit to be $2 less for me? Does that change my life? Not at all. Having this hot dog, does it change my life? Yes. Simple calculation. Because you're not making a calculation for the welfare of the federal government, and you can't control what everyone else is doing. So how do you make that choice any other way but to accept the free thing? Like, it makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense.
People aren't being stupid. They're trying to help themselves in a crumbling world, as they say.
Yes, and this is one of the fundamental reasons that we're tapping into here. If we followed this route all the way through, this is one of the fundamental reasons I stopped being a conservative. Why I no longer feel like I'm a conservative. Because they're relying on some kind of patriotic service duty that allows people to step up and make sacrifices for this kind of common effort. And that's the response to this. Whereas I think a system where the incentives always aligned with the personal ones would work fundamentally better, right? That this is the predictable choice. And yes, people can rise above it. Yes, people can rise above it, but ultimately in the long run, will they? No. In the long run, you're gonna get some generations that are better than others. You're gonna get some more willing to sacrifice for the future than others. And ultimately the can will be kicked slowly down the road until eventually it explodes.
Because there have been times when the government has been not only conservative, but in a really good economic situation where they're even bringing in a surplus and they balance the budget for that year. And it's like, woohoo, we did it. But usually what that means is they just didn't add to the national debt for that year. So they didn't actually fix any of the problem. They just, for that year, didn't add to it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
They're still paying interest on that debt. They haven't taken care of that debt problem. It's still there. They just didn't make it worse that year.
Yeah. And I think this system allows for that illusion. It allows for people not to feel the consequences of their choices. It hides the cost, essentially, right? It hides the cost in ways that you always feel them in your personal life, or at least you have to blind yourself not to feel them. At some point, they come and kick you. Here, they may never. They may fall on your children. The incentives are so fundamentally removed from what I understand to work on people, right? To actually influence people and change their behavior. That I just don't see. I don't see people stepping up. I think a collapse is going to happen. I think we have to take at least some minor hits like COVID to wake up and maybe the people could wake up and step up. Maybe. For a time. Right? And maybe that those times are frequent enough that we hang on for the foreseeable future. I've been encouraged as Brad and I have been looking at international things, to see other countries moving in the opposite direction. Right? Anytime there's a British statesman who, cracks me up. His name escapes me. I know his face and his voice well. But he talked about how they had exported their ideas to the United States, and they hoped that the ideas could then be exported from the United States back to them. And help them out.
That's funny.
And he said, and then he's like, Britain is driving off a cliff, and I look in our rear view mirror, and I see America trying to overtake us. Just,
that's funny.
The way he phrased it, there's some real truth to that. If you had to say, to jump back to the big picture, Brad, unless you had a comment on some of those scattered ideas I'm throwing.
Yeah. The big picture here is that these problems are not imminent, but these problems are large, and so we're not crying panic here. We're not saying freak out. We're saying there's an inability here to freak out that will ultimately result in an economic collapse of large proportions.
Yes.
So I don't know what you'd call that. It's a weird fatalistic despair. You know, we're in a slowly burning theater and we're saying, have you noticed that it's impossible to say the word, and then you can't say fire because it's just impossible to say it for some reason. You're like, don't you think that's a problem? Don't you think there's a problem here? And people are like, yeah, but what do you do? And like, I don't know, but that's not enough of a reason to do nothing. As the building slowly burns.
Should be done, right? Right? We're still in this building.
So that's what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, there's something off here about the fact that this is not even close to being on the table of having a solution, you know? Almost all of the solutions being proposed, all of the solutions being seriously looked at, like when people talk about balancing the budget, just aren't even close. So we need a serious reevaluation. We don't have a perfect solution here. We're not going to propose any solutions here, but we need to figure some out.
Yeah, this is so far out of the realm of what could be addressed, as you were saying, that the only rational choice, if you wanted to deal with this, is to start trying to figure out very, very, very small steps that could eventually work our way to addressing some of these problems.
See, and I'd say the exact opposite. I'd say that the solutions that I think have any hope of working are radical, out-of-the-box ideas where you're just going to look at something completely differently. You know what I mean? Like Medicare and Medicaid are a great example of that, where there's so much money being poured into there and how corrupt the healthcare system is that if you revamped that whole system, you could probably provide care for most of those people and have it cost half as much. Those are the kinds of solutions that I think are the only kind of thing that could get us out of a hole as big as we can't keep dumping $6 trillion into the federal budget each year. It's just not going to work.
No, you're absolutely right. I think as you say that, what we have to do with the mandatory spending programs, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, you're right. I think it has to be something like that. It has to be something rethinking it from the ground up. It's got to be out of the box, and you've got to be able to sell it. You've got to have evidence of it working in other places, ideally, and so on. In terms of getting some kind of, getting people back into a habit of, I don't know, budgeting? Is that the word we're looking for?
Fiscal responsibility?
Fiscal responsibility? I don't know. Some kind of, I don't know. I'm now thinking of it. It seems we have the tools to do this. We could do this. We lack the will. And the will here, in this case, is a moral failing of some kind, a failure to control ourselves, a failure to look long term. One of the reasons Paul's budget is going to be unpopular among the conservatives is it cuts defense. Defense is one of the biggest items on there. Surely we can cut something. Surely we can make that more efficient.
Yeah, and the conservatives are going to be like, we can never cut defense, to which I would reply with, what are the 40,000 troops stationed in Germany doing for our national defense? Because let me tell you, that base is not cheap.
We've actually discussed that particular base. We were talking about Ukraine, because that's kind of where they're poised, at least looking at right now. But that's not why they're there in Germany specifically. They're in Germany because of the world wars.
Mm-hmm. And that's why there are 40,000 there versus, you've got other NATO countries closer to Ukraine that'll only have 300 or 400. So if it was about Ukraine, You'd have more troops in those countries. But it's not about Ukraine.
It's about the Nazis.
It's about the Nazis. Like, seriously, like, that's why they're there, is because it was after World War II, a decision that was made almost 80 years ago and hasn't really been reevaluated since. That's why they're there.
That's crazy to think of it almost 80 years ago.
Generations ago, we decided to
almost
put troops
80 years ago?
Because this war ended in 45. Yeah,
we're 75.
2022.
77,
so that's 77, what is that, 77 years ago the war ended? And we started putting troops in Germany?
We're so much in the mindset still of the world wars, aren't we? We never got out of them.
Yeah, like they just happened. They did not just happen. World War II is a long time ago.
That's crazy. We are. Your summary, I think, was very good.
Here.
This is some kind of slowly encroaching fire, and it's so far off the table. People are arguing about all kinds of things in the room, and the fire is ignored, and eventually it will become a massive problem. It's already a problem to some degree, but one day explode per se or cause some kind of collapse or some kind of at least serious economic downturn beyond any of the things we're talking about, like with COVID and whatnot. It'll be on a scale it's truly epic. And in the meantime, just watch the clock, I guess. Go stare at it. Feel a little political existential dread.
It's good to feel that every once in a while.
We'll see ya.
This has been an episode of Rethinking Politics. You can find us on all of the major podcasting apps or on YouTube. You can reach out to us at rethinkingpoliticspodcast@gmail.com, or you can visit our website at rethinkingpolitics.podbean.com, where you can support us via Patreon. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.